Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Friday, January 18th today, and I'm sitting down to do take some questions from some of my viewers. They've kind of piled up for me over the past weeks, and I've been meaning to do this for a while. So if you are someone who's submitted a question, you've had to wait a while, I appreciate your patience. I know it's taken me a little bit to get around to this. So today's Q&A session focuses primarily on defining what a birth chart is, and then answering a stack of questions that I've received about the difference between what the transiting planets are saying and what your birth chart says. How do the two interact? How do the two get along with one another? So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions in my inbox that are all basically questions about how transiting planets interact with the birth chart. So I figured might as well do a Q&A talk on transiting planets and this phrase that's often used, natal promise. So sometimes you'll hear astrologers use the phrase natal promise. They'll say something like, you have transiting Saturn going through your 10th house of career, and then they may say something about how that transit of Saturn through your career house impacts your life given the natal promise of your birth chart. So what's being said really is that every transiting planet in the sky, when it's read in the context of your birth chart, will interact somehow with what your birth chart says about your life. So what's the relation between the two? Okay, well, let's start by defining a birth chart, right? What is a natal chart? And is there only one kind of natal chart? This is really important. Throughout the history of astrology, there have been a variety of different ways of casting a birth chart. I think it's very important to think about this, to really meditate on it, because what we're essentially saying is that a birth chart is not a hard science. It shouldn't be thought of in that way. Just like a tarot spread should not really be thought of as a hard science. Hard science meaning that it's put to the rigors of some kind of, closed, totally deterministic system. For example, birth charts have sometimes been cast by the moment of conception. When I was living in New York City, there was a famous photographer. What was his name? Thomas Laird, I think was his name. And he, anyway, I'm going to forget his name, but I think it was Thomas Laird. He had gone to Tibet to photograph the inner prayer chambers of the Dalai Lama. And this was a place that had never been seen by anyone other than, very high-ranking lamas and the Dalai Lama in particular. And this is a circular chamber, right? This is a really interesting story. It's a circular chamber in there's no light that comes in. And the inside of the chamber, circular walls are painted and covered with elaborate esoteric teachings. And when the way that a lama might be trained in these esoteric teachings would be by candlelight. So in the circular room, let's say the teacher would hold a candle and take the young student around the circle and illuminate little parts of the wall to explain various teachings. You could never see the whole wall at once, right? It's circular. You could never see it all at once because it's never all illuminated at once. So very interesting, right? Well, for fear of destruction at the hands of the Chinese, Laird had gone in basically, undercover with CIA grade photography equipment, if I remember correctly, and basically gotten the full print of the circular wall to preserve. And this was, of course, with the permission of the Dalai Lama, and this was all approved or sanctioned or whatever. So he brought this to the Rubin in New York, which is a very interesting museum that features Indian, Asian, Tibetan, Eastern art, I believe. It's been a while since I've been there. But at any rate, I had done an interview with him and had gotten to know him. I had done an interview with him for Reality Sandwich, and I'd gotten to know him. And he, when he came to New York City to pitch this to the Rubin, he had asked if I knew anybody who might like a private showing. He said, if you have any friends who have a gallery or some place where we could get together and put these out on the wall, I'll gladly show them to you. I thought, wow, this is really, really cool, right? So here are these elaborate esoteric teachings that were part of this circular room that could never be seen all at once. They used a candlelight to see it. And here we, neophyte Westerners, are going to be able to take a look at this. It felt almost like sacrilegious, right? But this was, again, this was all approved. It was all okay to share. And this was going to be something that was going to be hopefully coming out at the Rubin. So I organized with a friend of mine a showing, and we, I don't know, maybe a group of 20 or 30 of us or something got together to see these elaborate teachings all put out on the walls of an art gallery. And it was absolutely amazing. First of all, it was deeply esoteric. So a lot of it was like really mysterious and cryptic and sort of scary. But there was one thing that was really interesting, which was that there was a scene, and I remember it distinctly because I asked about it, and it showed a man and woman having sex in a graveyard, and they were having sex, and it was clearly a kind of astrologically themed moment. And he was saying, oh yeah, the astrological timing of conception, very important, very ritualistically done. So this was one of the first times that I ever had a glimpse of the kind of ancient rituals surrounding astrology and birth. And there's a strong history strong indications that the history of Western astrology is very similar in the sense that conception was also a valid time of looking at, of calculating birth. So sometimes birth charts are oriented toward the moment of conception, albeit that the moment of conception may have been ritualistically conceived of. So the astrologically timed sexual union that would lead potentially to a birth would be timed out. And we have evidence that ancient astrologers used the moment of conception as a viable birth time. Then we have the actual moment of birth, when the child actually comes into the world. But you also have to ask a very important question, which is, long ago in the ancient world, how exact, how precise would the calculation of birth have been? Some people may have been very aware of the timing of birth, specifically because of the use of astrology or the intended meeting with an astrologer, but others may have been a little bit more lax. This practice persists today. For example, in both of the births of my daughters, had I not marked down the time, the nurses would have marked down the time easily 5 to 10 minutes after the child was born. Now, I don't know, I can't say that all nurses are like that, but having been now in 2 birth situations and also speaking to our doula, it's not an exact science, right? Even today, in other words, there's some variation, enough that your rising sign could change. If a planet's on the cusp of a sign, it could change. A planet could change term or bound rulers within a degree. So that's not to say that, again, things are pretty reliable, with the birth time. But it is what we're trying to get at is that the way to conceptualize a birth chart, first and foremost, is not some like hard, deterministic, empiricist kind of mode. It's not in a hard empirical mode of thinking. There are different ritualistic moments that have been considered to be legitimate and accurate ways of casting a birth chart. For the sake of understanding the nativity, the birth, the individual's destiny, for understanding the future, the past, etc. Now, if you think that's a lot to wrap your head around, think about this. In the famous text on sort of Renaissance, late medieval sort of Renaissance text on astrology by William Lilly, famous classical text called Christian Astrology. This is not a Bible class on astrology either. He's a kind of very interesting Renaissance horary astrologer for the most part. He writes a very famous text on horary astrology that most schools around the world today, if you want to go study astrology, you'll have to read William Lilly's text. Lilly, in one of the chapters on how to do horary charts, he has a textbook section. There's a sort of theoretical section, and then there's like chapters that demonstrate actual horaries and their conclusions. And in the first chapter, when he's talking about the first house, the questions regarding the first house, he mentions that people may come in to ask about their life without information about their birth time, in which case he says that you can cast a horary to understand their life as you would a birth chart, but you would do it for the time that the client entered your office, so to speak. Client comes in and says, hey, I want to know about my destiny. I don't have a birth time. Well, what time is it right now? Okay, that's it. That's the chart we're going to use. And he demonstrates with great accuracy an example of such a case. This has always been astrology's most magical power, is that there is not just one agreed upon moment that can generate an accurate ritualistic chart that can speak to the life of an individual. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you can just go casting charts willy-nilly until you find one you like and then that's your chart or something like that. We're talking about an inherent flexibility in the nature of astrology such that when trying to conceptualize or understand what a birth chart is, you have to understand that first and foremost, it is a ritualistic act of divination, meaning that the language, the system, the apparatus of astrology is effectively used when it is used in concert with a ritual starting point. The ritual starting point might be the asking of a question. It might be the beginning of a birth. But there are different times that we could use to establish what birth is or when birth occurs. In my experience, one of the things that makes astrology work, as any system of divination I think works like this as well, it's the consistency of craft used over a long period of time, the same kind of ritual repeated, that familiarizes the reader with the language and the language with the reader, such that the channel is opened, so to speak, and the language can become the means by which a person may say things that are true about the life of an individual. I want to give you another example. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a woman come in for a reading. I started off the reading and started getting into it, and you know, we right away we were just clicking. It was, everything was right in place, and predictively too. I was able to say, like, this has happened recently. This has happened recently. This, you know, like, this is kind of where things have been. And it was very accurate, specific, not just general, like, oh, well, you know, you've been having a stressful year. It was very specific things we were saying about marriage, very specific things we were saying about what the past year and a half has been like in finances or whatever, right? Just very specific delineations. Suddenly, I mentioned her rising sign, and she goes, wait, that's not my rising sign. And I said, oh, what? Wait, what? I realized by some fluke of my software that the program had accidentally her um, switched her birth chart over to a sidereal view, so everything was thrown off. So suddenly I was working with a sidereal, meaning a sort of Indian orientation to the birth chart, and I didn't know that I was, right? What's really interesting is that this was the second time I visited with this client. And the first time we visited together, the same exact thing happened. I started off the reading, and for some reason, when her chart was generated, my program, which it's never done this before that I can ever think of, suddenly calculated the program as a default sidereal chart rather than a tropical chart, which is what everything else is set to in my system. So it was one of those really weird sort of synchronicities. In both examples, when I switched over to tropical, of course, a slightly different view of the exact same areas of her chart being emphasized, in some cases by the same transits, some cases slightly different transits, were all there. This is another thing that you'll experience with birth charts, which is that you will find that oftentimes you get a reading from an Indian astrologer with a different arrangement of your chart, and still what an astrologer will say about your past, present, and future can be incredibly accurate. And again, we're not just talking about general psychological, woo-woo. We're talking about things like, in this case, for example, I was able to, the woman's husband had died recently. So we're talking about very specific things that had happened and in very specific areas of life, real heartbreak, real difficulties in the marriage place, right? Well, that shifted a little bit in the sidereal, but it was still there through a slightly different transit. So these kinds of things are like, if you keep around astrology long enough, you can't avoid these things. There's a similar story, right? Here's another one. This is found in a great book by Jeffrey Cornelius called The Moment of Astrology, which is about, the whole book is really an excellent, beautiful argument about the divinatory nature of astrology. In that book, he gives the example of how astrologers working with the incorrect birth chart of Princess Diana were able to generate very accurate predictions about her death. And then, having found out the real time, we find a slightly different transit at the exact same time that gives us basically the exact same conclusion. Now, people will always talk about confirmation bias in astrology. They'll say, oh, astrology works this way because it's all just confirmation bias and it's all just crap. Well, I've found over time that people who have that kind of mindset, I just don't talk to about astrology unless they're really going to open their mind. Most of the time, no. So I don't get into those kinds of arguments with people. But what I can say from having observed this phenomenon, day in and day out, year round for, going on 9 years now, is that first of all, a birth chart is an oracle. It is oracular. It's a mantic device, which means that the motivation for approaching it, the ritual of the approach, the tradition and the ritual of the reader, the language and the established relationship of the symbolic language and the procedures of divination done over time, that's where we start moving from static to a clear signal. A clear signal starts coming through. So first of all, I think in order to talk at all about what transits are and how they relate to a birth chart, you have to start by understanding what a birth chart is. A birth chart is not a hardwired, absolute, only one way of doing it, only one way of reading it. A birth chart, like a tarot spread, is an oracular experience that has some flexibility in terms of how it's arranged or how it's timed or how it's, mostly now we do the time of birth. I do that. That's what I'm sticking with. But it's important to understand that what the birth chart is able to say is, first and foremost, it's flexible because, what I should say, let me reverse this and say it like this. the birth chart is here to speak something about our destiny, about our individual life and our destiny. And the reader is the interpreter of that language, but the language can be oriented slightly differently according to, different house systems or different zodiacs or different conceptualizations of what birth is, or if you don't have a birth time. So we have to remember that ultimately what we're consulting is not a chart, it's not the sky, it's the divine speaking through a language of the planets, of the sky, and being the voice pouring through the chart that we erect in a ritualistic manner. So I think that's very fundamental to really, if you really want to understand what transits are in relation to a birth chart, I think you have to start by understanding that your birth chart, first and foremost, is the means by which a divine intelligence can speak to you about why you're here, about what your life is going to be about. So that's where I wanted to start today. So I hope that this makes sense to everybody. Now, from there, we have to also remember that a birth chart is artificial. Artificial because you can't ever stop the heavens, right? The heavens keep moving. They never actually stop. The planets don't stop moving. So, and there was one time I heard this said, and I couldn't tell you where this source came from, but I heard it said once that all of the planets in the sky will never ever be identically all in the same place at the same time twice. The sun will burn out before that happens. I heard that somewhere and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. So you also have to remember that astrology is not a hard science insofar as nothing in astrology is ever absolutely 100% repeatable. There are repetitions and there are patterns and cycles that recur, but it's not a hard science in the sense that the system is there's never exactly the same thing twice. There's never exactly the same thing twice. So that's another important shift in consciousness that can help you understand why it's very personal. Astrology is actually deeply, deeply personal. A birth chart, again, is something, it's an artificially frozen moment, a picture of the sky that we use ritualistically for something divine and eternal to come through and speak to us in all of our idiosyncratic particularities. So I think that's another way of thinking about it. Nothing is ever in exactly the same place twice in the sky all together collectively. It's always new. It's always different. So just like if you go to speak, I mean, think about what defines intimacy in your life, right? What defines intimacy in your life is the ability to be surprised and the ability to be familiar in a kind of dynamic relationship with one another. So some things about someone that you grow to love or grow to know, whether it's a friend or a lover or a parent or a pet or whatever, is that you get to know things that are, characteristic, that are patterns that will repeat. And there's, I hate it. I grow sick of it. But then when a person dies, often what's the first thing we say? I'm really going to miss their crabby, whatever. Everything becomes sort of dear to us with hindsight. Love is like this. We grow familiar with things. Some of it we dislike, some of it we like. But that's how intimacy is formed. It's not just in the things that we like. Intimacy is formed by close proximity to someone, familiarity with someone or something over a long period of time. Both the stuff we love and find endearing and the stuff that we find frustrating. That's how intimacy is formed. Think about it like that. Then you also have surprises. Intimacy is also formed because someone is always new. There's always something new. What do you love about going on a road trip with your lover or your friend after you haven't spent time together? You get to press the reset button and have new experiences together. You have all sorts of new things to do and be surprised by. So similarly, what we have to understand about our lives here on Earth is that our lives feature that same duality because I'm going to make a bold sort of metaphysical claim here because that's how God is. That's how the divine is. The divine has elements about it that are familiar, that recur, that demonstrate patterns that we can get to know, that drive us nuts, that we don't like, that are scary, that we love. But then divinity is also new in every moment. There's also surprises awaiting us all the time. This is, reality's personal. It's not ultimately, you can't know something that you can completely contain and define and predict. You can't know something from the heart that's like that. So reality isn't like that either. There's elements of reality that are predictable that we can know with certainty, to sort of determinism and regularity. But what makes reality personal, what makes each of us personal, what makes the cosmos personal, is that it's also constantly new and constantly interesting and surprising us. So intimacy with the cosmos, intimacy with one another, intimacy with the divine, requires a way of understanding who we are and what is real that is both regular, predictable, and new in every moment. So this is a key part of understanding, again, what a birth chart is depicting. A birth chart is like, you sit down imagine at the very beginning of life, you're a baby and you're laying there and there's a sage sitting in front of you, and we'll call this sage the stars. And he's sitting in the lotus position, or she's sitting in the lotus position. And your parents are sitting there with you and they say, what will this child's life be like? And the chart is basically the medium through which that sage will then say something about the life of the child. This is what they'll be like. Here, let me tell you a little bit about them. Let me help familiarize you with them and with their life, right? But would you imagine that anyone, like a sage, if you sat down with a sage, that they would say, yeah, this person's, let me just spell it out for you. I'm going to give you like a calculated, a total calculus of exactly who they are, nothing left to predict here. It's all said and done. It's all totally determined, and there's no surprises really. So here it is. It's just a printout. And it's very important that it be hardwired, because remember, it's exact. It's an exact science. No, any sage would, if it's a real sage, would be like, okay, let me tell you something about the inner nature of this being, right? But they would also not be able to tell you exhaustively everything there is to know about this being, because the sage knows very well that this being is eternal, just like the sage is eternal. And that means the possibility of getting to know this individual, getting to know the sage, getting to know truth, getting to know each other, getting to know reality, is an ongoing infinite process. Intimacy never ends. So a birth chart is not meant to nail you down, right? It's not meant to do that. It's meant to speak to you, to familiarize yourself with yourself, or others with yourself, or yourself with the life that you're going to live, insofar as there are things that are regular, that are patterned, that you can get to know, both the good and the bad, to forge intimacy with your existence. But the birth chart also, the whole science of astrology has always left room for the inherent nature of who we are as beings, which is freedom. As spirit souls, we all have agency, right? So the birth chart is not stripping us of that. That's why, and that's also why there are a variety of different starting points that can speak to the life of an individual, because the different starting points reflect that ultimately there are different, slightly different subjective ways of trying to describe the most familiar, regular, patterned elements of a person or their life. One sage might say something about they might look into the nature of the being and say something like this, and it's true. It's really true. Another sage looks into the nature of the being like this and says a little something different, right? We just have to remember that the birth chart is like a screen The birth chart is a screen. It's the language through which something eternal and intelligent is able to speak to what the child is, or what the being is, or what their circumstances will be like. But that can't take away the organic, ongoing, eternal agency and choice that the individual has to be in relation to their life, being in relation to the patterns, to the elements of destiny or fate. That's pretty wide open, right? And so this is the framework that I'm trying to establish so that we can then talk about what transits are. When a transit is affecting a birth chart, when planets continue to move after you have an artificially frozen moment in the sky that you've established as your chart, right? The planets they're going to continue to move. Then the continued movements of the planets are projected into the artificially frozen moment of the birth chart. Then they have a relation with one another. One of the best ways of understanding the relation that they have is the exact same kind of relation that I'm describing in terms of the objective and the subjective. The birth chart tells us a lot about, sort of familiarizes us with the things about our life that are regular, something that's established about our nature. The ongoing transits in many ways talk about the in some ways unpredictable elements of the road trip of life that you're going to go on, right? The way that intimacy is forged by choices that we make, and new elements of ourselves that will participate in the journey. So it's a little, hopefully it's not too abstract, but so similarly, again, let's go back just a second and just sort of restate this one more time. So real intimacy is based on some elements of familiarity, but it's also based on being new and being surprised in an ongoing manner. If life in the cosmos is like that, if reality is like that, then a birth chart has to be able to reflect that same dynamic. There's certain regular things, but then there's an ongoing way in which intimacy is formed through surprising events, through freely chosen events that aren't always predictable. Okay, so when we think about transits, what you're really thinking about are the ongoing movements of the planets in the sky. Remember, they never really stop. They never really ever stop. So the birth chart is like an initial statement. It's like saying, this is how you're born. This is something about your nature. Now that statement is not just willy-nilly. It's not like you can just cast 3 more birth charts and then pick the one you like or something like that. There is a real karmic gravity to what your birth chart says. So if you take the birth chart seriously, the omens and indicators of the planets and stars at birth, they speak to your nature. And you're not going to get around the hardwired quality of it. Just like your grandpa or just like your friend or whatever is going to be consistently themselves in the ways that are familiar and patterned and recognizable and repeatable. All of us work like that. That's part of how the material world operates. There is predictability. So you can't just get away from that. One of the ways we talk about this is thus through the phrase natal promise. So that birth chart says something about who you're going to be, what's going to happen, and it's not really a negotiation. It's, just like since I've been a little boy, I've been interested in writing. Just like I was born the son of a preacher, and in a way, my life has taken on a kind of astrological preacher motif, right? So those are things that, anybody who knows me, who's known me for a long time, even if you just watch my stuff, you're like, oh, it's Adam. He's talking about the same old stuff. He's kind of, or whatever. There, it's like, my personality. So that part of us it's not just going to change. That's what we call natal promise. Natal promise means that there are certain things in your life. It doesn't matter how many vision boards you do, how much positive thinking you do, how much, we repeat the mantras, I'm going to create my own reality. All of that stuff is completely, it's just complete woo-woo in the face of the undeniable face of certain elements of our life that are fated, from character to calling to events that are going to happen in our lives. There is a big part of our life that is regular, predictable, and fated. And you just have to get comfortable with that if you're going to do astrology, in my humble opinion. Now, at the same time, and again, I think our experience bears this out. Look at the world. Look at, turn on the news every day. Can you predict that the president will tweet something that's, of a certain character? Yes, you can. Why? Because he's predictable, because we all are. On a certain level, we are all very predictable. In a certain level, life is predictable. In fact, that's how astrology has its power. That's how medicine has its power, and science has its power, and that's how technology has its power, because a huge amount of material reality is predictable. So familiarizing ourselves with the birth chart means that we take in, on a certain level, the fact that our lives are not fully in our control. They are the result of all different kinds of inborn, fated or predetermined characteristics. Now, we can speculate endlessly about where they come from or why they're there, or whatever. I won't go into that sort of esoteric wormhole today, but let's just agree that if like, for example, my daughter, Virginia, who's 3 going on 4 now, since she was born, like very early on, right? Like her birth chart is a perfect example of all of her personality quirks, all of her she's been her since she was born. I know that there is nature and there is nurture, right? But the birth chart has a very strong way of telling us what you're born with, what kind of cards you're dealt. And you're going to be playing those cards out through life, right? So, for example, the birth chart, you can see that, some people are going to deal repeatedly with really difficult things in relationships. Some people are going to be born into situations where there's great wealth. Some people are going to be born with a natural inclination to higher education or to traveling abroad. Some people are going to have siblings that are really troubled and that are reckless. Some people are going to have a father or mother that's terrible. Some people are going to have a father who's an incredible role model. Some people are going to deal with degenerative health conditions. The birth chart tells us about these things. So then what we have, so that's called natal promise, and the birth chart just gives us that. Then we have the ongoing transits, the ongoing movements of the planets. The ongoing movements of the planet for thousands of years have been inserted into the birth chart, right? So you take, say you have Jupiter in Sagittarius, and you would, right now, if you're doing a transit report, you would say, where is Jupiter, where is Sagittarius in your birth chart or my birth chart? And you place Jupiter into that place in your chart because that's where it is in the sky right now. So it's kind of like you're looking at the ongoing movements of the planets after the birth chart is cast and just watching them move through the freeze frame moment of the birth chart. So people then always ask, does that mean that the ongoing transits will bring, can they do anything or indicate anything that is different from what the birth chart is saying, right? This is at the heart of all the questions, like 7 questions in my YouTube question and answer inbox were all, can the planets do something different than what's indicated in the birth chart? So all of this has been a lead up to try and explain this. The planets that are transiting in the sky are, you could say, like they're symbolically moving through areas of the chart that indicate certain kinds of natal promise. So I'm going to give you an example from my client practice right now. It's anonymous. Here we have a sun in Libra in its fall in the 8th house, and it is conjoined with Mars in Libra in its detriment, also in the 8th house. Now, when I will start a session with a client, a lot of the times we'll look at all the, different factors in the chart as natal promise. These are the kinds of themes and patterns that are going to be, you will experience these in your life, and they will likely repeat. These are the kind of perennial flowers growing in the garden of your life. These are the flowers of karma that we're going to blossom up at least once, if not multiple times repeatedly throughout your life in these areas of life. And that does not mean that you're limited to one kind of experience. Your consciousness and how you react or relate to your experiences is very wide open. That's why it's so important to have an inner life, to do astrology, to have a spiritual life, because then these karmic flowers that blossom in our life, our natal promise, what the birth chart is telling us, are not inherently the source of, they do not inherently define whether we have a happy life or a good life or a beautiful life. That's a lot of that depends on how we cultivate our inner life and our consciousness in relation to the events of destiny. But when this sun in its fall with Mars in its detriment in Libra in the 8th house, in the chart, what we read that as initially was, we said there may be real struggles and hardships surrounding the assets or resources of significant others or partners or spouses. That's one interpretation. You may end up the breadwinner, or you may have a spouse whose wealth is lost, or there may be challenges around the spouse's ability to make money, or sometimes you could end up in situations where you're dependent upon a spouse because their income, they're the breadwinner, but they lord it over you in a way that's hostile and difficult. Those are all different interpretations of a sun in its fall with Mars in its detriment in a daytime chart in the 8th house, right? So after I interpreted that, I said, there, among some other possibilities, we kind of give a range, said, how does that sit? And this particular client said, yeah, that sits, that's pretty accurate. So I said, okay, maybe she told me a few stories, very specific, about having been the breadwinner in the relationship and having dealt with issues with finances and spouses or significant others that had been very difficult. Okay, so a transit. You could go into the past, for example, and I say, okay, well, I'm going to go back into the past with Pluto. And at this point in time, Pluto was square to, I went back to Neptune and Uranus and Capricorn. So Neptune and Uranus and Capricorn had squared the Sun and Mars conjunction. So I'd gone back in time and I had said, at this time should have been a time where that natal promise was manifesting, the one that we just talked about around spouses and money. And now it was transiting her 11th house in Capricorn. So groups, friends, associates, etc. Well, she had been at that time, when we went back in time, I said, this specific year of your life, Neptune and Uranus were square to Mars and the Sun. So this natal promise should have been activated. This is a time when that flower of your karma should have been blossoming and showing itself in the garden of your life, so to speak. What was happening around that time? And remember, this is Uranus and Neptune from the 11th house, making a square to the Mars, Sun in the 8th house. So she had been a part of a group, and there had been difficulties in the group, specifically related to her significant other, who was also part of the group, and money. And it was kind of a big ordeal. And it was another major turning point in her life. So transits work like that. That's the first and foremost. You have to understand that transits are not really telling us anything. On one level, they're not telling us anything new. A transit is giving you a sense of exactly when a particular kind of karmic pattern that you're born with will manifest in your life in a very powerful way. And the transit is, in a sense, to be looked at as a trigger or a release for inborn natal karma. So it's not changing the fundamentals of your natal karma in any way. It's more like the hands of the clock that continue to tick, and then they reach a certain point and they say, okay, around this time in this area of life, this natal karma should spring up. You should see it very vividly. The planets involved, like Neptune and Uranus in this case, and the house involved, the 11th house groups, they should tell us something about the stimulus. Where is the stimulus coming from? And maybe what type of stimulus that is, in a sense, stimulating the blossoming of a particular inborn karma, a natal promise. So that's the way that I think we have to conceptualize it first in terms of natal promise. This is all symbolic, by the way. It's not like, you know what I mean? Like you're looking at when planets that never stopped moving are artificially interacting with a freeze frame moment from the past, right? So you first of all, you just have to wrap your head around that. Like when I did this transit for her, this transit report, we were looking at a moment that was like, 20, 30 years after she was born. 20, 30 years after she was born, the planets are in the sky, are relating to an artificially moment from the past where the planets were temporarily suspended in certain places in the sky. That's what we're doing with transits in a birth chart, right? So simplest way to understand them, to just put a bow around it, is to say that transits give you an indication of the kind of stimulus and kind of area of life that's going to push on and release an inborn natal karma. So that's that. It's really that simple. It's not changing anything fundamental. The other thing is that this is where the second question comes in: is there anything about your can the transits cause something that's not there, sort of in the birth chart? Well, no. And the simple reason I answer no is because insofar as you're reading the interaction of the planets in your birth chart, they are relating to things that were depicted in the birth chart. So the simple answer is no. And Robert Schmidt said the same thing when I talked to him about this at one point, and also in a number of his lectures when he taught, by looking at the way that ancient Greeks conceptualized transits. One of the conclusions that he had drawn was that a transit can't make something that isn't already depicted in some way in the birth chart. For example, let me give you a very simple example. Let's say that you have Pluto, heavy as a heavy, intense planet, right? Pluto, Lord of Death and Hades and rebirth and things like that, transiting your 7th house of marriage. But let's say that you're in your house of marriage, you have a really well-dignified Venus, no hard aspects from Venus, maybe a trine from a nicely placed Jupiter, something like that. If the natal chart doesn't give an indication that there are severe or intense challenges around the topic of marriage, then we wouldn't expect that Pluto transit to generate something that's completely off the map of what your natal chart is saying, right? So you, as the reader, it's not that you're not going to have some kind of experience in love, right? It's not that you're immune from ever having any hardships if you have a nice looking 7th house of marriage. But it's that we read it within the context of what the natal promise is. So the natal promise looks pretty strong and pretty good around a certain topic. You wouldn't expect transits through that house or to the ruler of that house or whatever to indicate things that are really, really, really shitty or something like that. Like, for example, if you have a hard transit from Saturn, let's say, to really nicely placed Jupiter that rules your financial house, you might have some financial strain or some financial difficulties, but the likelihood is that you'll still come out on top. You'll still, in a sense, in subjective realm, you'll still come out ahead. Now, in other words, you can't just reverse what the birth chart is saying. So transits always have to be read in the context of what the birth chart is saying. That's the simplest message. That's what we mean when we say transits can only impact the chart in terms of the natal promise. Okay, but remember, I prefaced all of this by saying there is also an element of life that has to do with the fact that nobody is ever 100% knowable. Like even there, one of my favorite things that I heard a spiritual teacher of mine say recently is that one of the most beautiful things about God is that God doesn't even fully know himself or herself or itself. That the ongoing process of intimacy and love and God experiencing God's self is itself unendingly new. And this is what, in a sense, love is based on. Love is based on the ability for intimacy to keep going. And intimacy is about what's familiar, what's repetitive, but it's also about what's new. Similarly, every day when I chant my japa beads, or when I do my mantras, or when if you have a practice, you walk in circles, or you run in circles, or you swim laps, or you do something that's repetitive. There's a repetitive element. But isn't it amazing how inside of the repetition, there is a kind of constant newness? So we circumambulate the shrine, right? We go through the prayer beads in a circle. We chant the rosary in a circle. We go through these circular repetitive processes. But as we do so, it's amazing what newness continues to open up within it. So birth charts and transits also have to be understood on that level simultaneously. You're not going to just radically change the fundamentals, the regularity. In the same way, there's not many spiritual traditions that suggest that you can have spiritual life without that you can change your consciousness or lift your consciousness without the repetition of cyclical, repetitive prayers, mantras, exercises, whatever. There's a certain element of this world that's hardwired like that. You have to work through these kinds of things. Right? That's just like part of it. But then there's also this newness that comes through. And how do transits reflect that newness? Well, transits are also they are always reflecting the ongoing unfolding of creation, right? So even though there's certain elements that are repetitive and predictable, remember back to the original thing that we said about astrology, the planets are never fully all together in the exact same place twice. Nothing in life, because reality is inherently personal and alive, nothing is ultimately repeated twice in the full sense, right? So there's also a very strong way in which the ongoing transits reflect the ongoing relation that you have to the natal karma that you're born with. And that's very, very important, because how you react or respond to your destiny, to your karma, also matters a great deal. So you may not be able to, you're born in a sense within a certain sphere of activities that has certain limits, right? Like I'm boarding a plane this afternoon to go home for my grandmother's funeral this weekend. The moon Saturn conjoined the moon in my birth chart, by the way, to the minute within an hour of her death, right? That's what I mean when I say there's certain things that are unavoidable. There is these, you can't believe the degree of intelligence and precision and beauty that's worked into everything. This is the perfect symphony being operated at the perfect level in every moment, always, right? It's like that. So there's some things, again, they're just hardwired. But then if I'm getting on this plane this afternoon, and I'm going to be in the air for like an hour or two or whatever. During that plane ride, I may not have a choice about the plane's trip from destination A to destination B. Like, that's locked in. There's not a lot I'm going to do about that, right? But while I'm on the plane, I could get up, I could move around, I could read books, I have a few books that I bring, I could write a note, I could get on my phone, I could watch a flip down movie or whatever. So the field of activities within which we move is also has always been understood as like, okay, here's the cards you're dealt, but you also have to play those cards in a sense. We have a relation to the hardwired karma of our life, especially when that hardwired karma blossoms, when it shows up in our life. The way that we respond to it, the meaning we make, or the choices that we make in relation to it, very, very important. So it's very important because remember that all of the events in this lifetime are thought to be shaped by or given shape by momentum of choices from previous lifetimes. That's certainly what ancient astrologers seem to have believed, especially when you look at the strong influence from Hermeticism, from Egypt, from India. This was the way that they thought about it. So when we think about the influences that are coming through now, activating our natal karma, we also have to think about those influences as things that we react or respond to that start shaping future karma. And any and every event has the potential to be spiritualized. We can react to it in a way that perpetuates and deepens our identification with the deterministic side of things. And we do that by being predictable in our responses to the predictable events of our karma. You get something you don't like, you respond with anger. You just had a predictable human response to a predictable outcome, that was probably promised in your birth chart. Oh, I lost my job, or oh, I was born with a family that was like this or that was like that, and we get so we say it's not fair. I'm so angry. I'm so mad. I get bitter about it. Whatever, and then those reactions, those are predictable, in a sense, reactions. That's exactly what all wisdom traditions tell us is most predictable about human life, is to be sort of selfish, to be consumers, and then when we don't like what we get, to rail against it. And it's like a vicious cycle. And to the extent that we live in that cycle, we live locked into a more deterministic framework. It's not about intimacy, it's about regularity. There's nothing more regular and less predictable and less free than just living our lives in terms of like what I want, what I desire, what I need, etc. When we start responding to the events of destiny and karma differently, seeking to spiritualize our lives and change our consciousness, then every event of destiny becomes an opportunity to see the divine intelligence, to hear the voice of divine reason, to dial into the heavenly teachers, to learn and grow and to cultivate more of our true freedom, and to establish the intimacy, to be able to see, even though this is predictable, my consciousness makes it new, makes it different, makes it a slightly different kind of experience. So the transits in a birth chart should also always be understood in terms of the continued flow of the Tao, the continued flow of material nature, and the way that it's activating our natal promise, our natal karma, but it's also providing us with the opportunity to create new responses and to have new insights to or with our karma, such that we become increasingly liberated. Liberated meaning we go through all kinds of experiences, but we do so with eyes that are new, with a heart that's new, with a mind that's new in every moment. And then we see the riches filled within the regular, filled with the mundane. The mundane is filled with riches. This is something that I think was exemplified by the life of the great poet Mary Oliver, who passed away yesterday. I think it was yesterday she passed. Read her poetry. The most mundane, first of all, she was very ritualistic. She has a book called Why I Wake Early. She's basically like a nun. That's how I think of her, as a poet nun, a naturalist poet nun, a little like an Emerson. She gets up routinely. She goes out to the world of the familiar, of the tooth and nail, of the death, of the consumption. She sees nature for exactly what it is. She's not a sentimentalist. And yet, because she brings with her a newness of consciousness in every moment, all that is predictable, the death, the little bone that you find on the trail while you're walking that suggests the hardness of life and the unavoidable realities of life. She has a way of making every one of those things new, every one of those things precious, sacred, brimming with beauty, right? So similarly, every transit is an invitation to experience our karma and the blossoming of our karma from the standpoint of the transcendental self. And so studying transits is not just studying when your natal karma is going to blossom, it's also instructive in terms of the things that are triggering the arrival of the inborn karma. They are the teachers. They are the perspective. They are the riches brimming over from our experiences. So we have to look at them that way so that we start to relate to our karma differently. And that's ultimately what starts informing our ability to make completely different decisions, creating a sort of different patterns. Ultimately, of course, the purpose is not about trying to relate to our karma differently so that I can sort of navigate my way to a desired outcome or result. The more that we get into this process, the natural spiritual conclusion is that the number one way to maintain freedom is through surrender. Because freedom is freedom is freedom, right? Freedom is not the freedom to go about and get a result, because results in the material world, when you get attached to them, take away your freedom. So this is a practice, really, that when we say that the transits are also invitations to intimacy, what we're saying is not so much that you can manipulate the energies of transits to get something you want. It's more about the way that the transits provide a portal to relate to yourself and to your own karma and to the karma of the world around you in a way that opens your heart and mind and returns you to your true nature, which is freedom. So I hope that this helps, that this has been a useful discussion around the topic of natal promise and transiting planets and how the two relate to one another. These are my observations. A lot of this stuff comes from Robert Schmidt and what he had to say about what the Greek philosophers seem to have been thinking about transits. But it also comes from, obviously, my own realizations and my understanding of sacred scriptures as well. Now, the last thing I'll read to you is this. This is from the Bhagavad Gita. This is one of the final statements of the Bhagavad Gita. And this is, to me, this is the scriptural teaching that helps us to understand the heart of what's happening in both the natal promise of the chart and the ongoing transits and how they relate to one another. At the very end of the Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna, "The Supreme Lord is situated in everyone's heart, O Arjuna, and is directing the wanderings of all living entities, who are seated as on a machine made of the material energy. O scion of Bharat, surrender unto him utterly. By his grace you will attain transcendental peace and the supreme and eternal abode. Thus I have explained to you knowledge still more confidential. Deliberate on this fully, and then do what you wish to do." So thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you have a great day today, and that this has been fruitful, interesting stuff to think about. We'll see you again for the eclipse in a couple days. Okay, take care. Bye.